matter who you are, where you are, what your choices have been, and what karmic timelines and contracts you have journeyed, the light is calling for the reunification of all aspects of life in this realm now. It is calling for the cleansing of all polarities. It is calling for the rising of all sacred heart centers now. All are being summoned home to the greater light now.
Hi, and welcome to Whole Soul Mastery's Live Well, Live Whole podcast series. I'm Marie Mohler, and I'm an author, intuitive, and a messenger of the Rising Hero's journey and this timeline that we're all in of integrating into a greater wholeness and oneness inside us. And I'm here today with Matthew Crofoot. And welcome, Matthew. I'm so grateful you could join me today. And we're going to explore a lot of things because we're in what we could call a sea of vibrational soup in some ways on the planet right now. And many of us are actually in the time of letting a lot of this go, of really engaging a bigger departure from not only the global narratives, the national narratives, the mainstream media's narratives, but even our own narratives about ourselves, right? The identities and the costumes that we've worn and the values and the belief systems we have about ourselves. We're really being summoned to live larger, to really expand more into who we really are and let the illusions fall where they may. Just let these older versions of us fall away. And of course, that brings up discomfort because some things are like, oh, so glad that that's gone. Like, right? We've wanted those things to fall away. And then there's some things that may not be serving us, but we may still be in a little bit of a tug of war, not quite ready to let them go, but proclaiming we don't like the effects of those things in our lives. So it's a big time to get real with ourselves, to get high, I think, on these new higher frequencies in a way, and also let ourselves let go of the things that aren't meant for us and the versions of ourselves that part of us is still believing in, because we're in this in-between timeline right now, but more and more we're feeling something else summon us forward. A lot of us are anyway. And as we enter this conversation today, and I want to invite our listeners, of course, because we're all in this journey together. We're all experiencing this in our own ways. So as you and I talk today, Matthew, we're going to be illustrating or expressing some things in our experiences and lessons we've learned and tools that we have that will touch other people, because in the oneness, we all can benefit from each other, right? So definitely. Yeah, so I really want to talk about this time of the misinformation, the disinformation, the getting real with ourselves, the call to go higher, the pulls and draws to go backwards and be our, these other versions of ourselves that we've been for so long and aren't really serving us. So that's a lot to just, be talking about. It's probably a series of podcasts, but right. First, before we get into some of this, do you just want to tell our listeners just a little bit about you and, where you are in the journey and, kind of your background and how you found your way to, your present consciousness now, the awakening? Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I guess my journey started over 20 years ago with kind of being struck down with a chronic illness and like some pretty severe anxiety and chronic fatigue. And it actually happened while watching The Matrix. I was watching like a midnight showing of The Matrix. And right at the moment Neo realizes the world is not real, like I just was filled with nausea and I just basically passed out, and I was sick for like 5 days after that. And I kind of went into a traumatic freeze state after that, because I think I wasn't prepared to realize the message I had just received. And it's like, whoa, I awoken and I'm like, whoa, I'm not ready for this. And so like 15 years later, after like trying everything not to be present in my body and just dealing with being sick and stuff, I kind of came back into my body, had a bit of a nervous breakdown, and basically said, oh, wow, there's a lot more going on than I'm aware of. So my focus was very internal at that point on my own pain and suffering and healing, and kind of developing a relationship with myself again. So I've always been interested in natural health, and over this journey, I've learned just about everything about health, and more recently gotten really interested in energetic healing and subconscious belief work. And so I'm a holistic healer, and I work with people with basically their beliefs, helping clear traumas and fears and limiting beliefs so that they can actually move forward in their life, have more energy, more clarity, more peace, and more
Mm.
abundance, right? So it's kind of what it's all about. And we're going to talk a bit about belief systems, like how we kind of these things come into our lives so unconsciously, and they just run our worlds, right? So maybe today we'll have some tools for people listening to overcome those things and to start becoming more aware. So
That's beautiful. It's amazing. It's almost like, I don't know if you've conceptualized it this way, but when you just described your journey, I think you said 20 years or so. Sounds like about 15 of those years you were in the sickness or the density or the illness part of it. Well, surviving those experiences and really coping with what you were experiencing. But then there's like a secondary awakening that came back for you to help you unpack some of the layers, that onion that had formed, not just this lifetime, as we know. It's really it's an accumulation of debris that enters our fields that we carry through time. It's like a companion. It's like a companion backpack that we carry in with us. And it's almost like, I don't know that you would say it this way, but if we said, like, lightning struck the night of the Matrix movie that you saw to awaken you to something different, but it's kind of spiraled you into greater experience of illness. And that's a long time to be in that 10 to 15 year journey. I don't have to tell you that. And then lightning strikes again with the answer. It's like the call and response, right? And there's the call when you have that, during the Matrix movie, what a movie to be called, in the red pilling of that movie, striking through your whole being enough that it was shattering some things inside you. And it's almost like you had to experience that kind of 10 to 15 years of breaking down in your system, breaking down health, to then have the second strike, the response, the echo, to bring in the greater awareness that led you on more of this holistic healing, gaining more of these tools, things crystallizing a little more clearly, letting go of those limiting beliefs and all those things, and then putting you on the path as healer to help other people do the same thing of, like, release more of these layers. And let's talk a little bit about that, beliefs and beliefs, where they come from, and a sense of what is truth, because we also talk a lot about, I certainly do in my marinades, about the misinformation and the disinformation and the sea of vibrational soup, that sea of confusion that humanity seems to be in. And there's information coming from just about everywhere. I said it in a recent podcast with another guest. You can't even pump gas in your car. I don't know if it's where you live, but you've got the TV at the gas station blaring out of the pump.
yeah.
And I wish I had like noise canceling headphones when I go, like you're wearing right now, just to pump gas. That's a sign of the times, right? Think about much earlier times where there's like a shepherd tending his flock, and he's out in nature all day, and he just is listening to whatever he or she was listening to. But imagine the silence, imagine the solitude and the quiet and the peace, and look at the contrast of our world today of everything is blaring 24/7. And even if our devices are off, they're putting out those EMF frequencies, right? So we're just being bombarded in a lot of ways. A lot of people don't even have the language for this, but they feel it and they express it in all different ways, maybe illness, maybe stress and tension or anxiety. So when we are being bombarded by this information, it's like a spiritual battle that's happening just below the surface, where some people can't see that, but they can also see that things have gotten more hectic or chaotic or confusing. How do we sift through this sea of information and even begin to talk about what truth is? right? And you work with
Yeah.
people about their beliefs because that's what comes up in the healing sessions and the work that you do. Yeah, where do you want to start with some of that?
Yeah, well, I think you laid a great groundwork. There's this like media constantly bombarding us with a message, and we're starting to discover that this isn't just a random message or like a message that hasn't been thought out. It's actually very structured, and it serves certain interests. So that kind of gets down the road a little bit. But even like from the day you're born, you learn from your parents, but where did your parents learn from? You learn from your school system, but we're starting to see how the school is changing. What they teach is changing. The history is changing. They're like, yeah, they're just bringing in new ideas, right? And sculpting the next generation through that. We see in the churches, right, that what they teach you, especially about like spirituality and stuff. Like you and I can like have like a different spiritual experience, and they might teach you something like that sounds like really bad, like you're gonna like burn in hell and like all this fear and all this stuff, like all this judgment. And like, does that resonate with the spirituality in you? Not me, not for me. It's like it seems like more programming. So we
Mhm.
have to have discernment. I mean, that's what the call today is about, is discovering that discernment. So the first step, I think, is also realizing that if you're unconscious of all this, you are going to be a victim of it. You're going to be at the lowest vibration. You'll be in the lowest energies and emotions, such as like fear and shame and doubt and guilt, because that's what's being sent at you, right? And so the first step is realizing that the collective conscious energy on you, all these things that, everything you've learned has been through these systems. And then you also get into these filter bubbles too, where it's like it might be like polarized by political party, or it might be polarized by like where you live or different
Mhm.
belief systems, right? And then you tend to attract all the information that just proves your own point, right? And
Right. It's called
uh
like confirmation bias, I think, in
yeah,
psychology or in research, right? Yes,
exactly.
you want to
And
have
so
confirmed what you already think you know.
right, and it feels good to have that. So big tech has mastered algorithms to do that, and even if it's an opposing view of potentially what they're trying to push, it divides the people. So that's why it's important to them, because the key of all this is to have you not think for yourself, not think critically. And then the last piece, which we've seen a lot, is censorship recently, which is you don't even know that you don't know because it's obscured from you. So all this leads us to a moment of awakening and awareness, where one day you say, I think there's more going on than I actually see. And then that guides us into this conversation of what to do with that when you go to look for that information and realize it's the Wild West. So, but let's take a step back to the spiritual moment of that awakening and that awareness, Marie. So what do you like? What's that like for you? Like, when did that happen for you? Or what's that like for a new person experiencing that, perhaps?
Right. You asked such a great question, and it's worth repeating. Like, what's that like, the awakening for you? And that's a question we can ask anybody that's listening to reflect a little bit about their own awakening. And if they don't feel like they're having one, if they're listening to a podcast like this, they're probably on course to have
Yeah.
one. So welcome. That's what we want to say, is welcome to the great awakening. And you I grew up like you. I had parents that did not give me this language. So I wasn't given this language, these understandings. Some of us come to this journey of the awakening reluctantly because something has catalyzed their experience, whether it's the matrix for you. For me, it was a severe um, summoning by spirit. That's a story that I think will be bigger and told another day, but it had lots of illness components to it, lots of seeking doctors for answers, lots of steps of faith and having to honor the guidance that was given from spirit, not unlike a Mary and Joseph situation, being summoned to a task and then having to meet the task the way that it unfolded.
Mm,
Right? Mary's excited to have this beautiful baby, if you believe that, that's a child of God, right? And she's this vessel to a holy purpose, only to later see that her son needed to be crucified as part of his life journey and his story and the gift given back to humanity. So these are things that awaken us. Not that everybody identifies with the Mother Mary story or the Mary story, but we are called to do things in our lives. And that's when people experience a great catalyst. And I think a lot of people's awakening comes from that. I think it can be even more challenging and more subtle when it's little subtle nudges and no big firestorm comes into your life. You don't
Right.
see like 5 angels of God coming to you and giving you messages. Sometimes it's subtler, like you knew that it was a defining moment. It seemed like it was undeniable that what happened to you in that Matrix movie, that changed the course of something inside you. Many of us feel that these, like a cancer comes in, or losing a job, or a partnership just completely falling away unexpectedly. I think awakenings, in the way I'm describing it, sometimes they come a little bit fast and furiously. It's like an event. It's something you can really say, I was different after that moment in time.
Mm.
And I've definitely had that experience. And I journeyed with what was mine to do very intensely for at least 5 years. So it's like a 5-year dark night of the soul. And
Right.
then you still have the fallout from that, where you're still learning. But I was already activated in seeking truth. And I want to bring up this point. Sometimes when we have events like this, these catalyzing experiences, that's when we'll go looking and saying, well, that can't possibly be happening to me. So you go looking for answers, whether it's a doctor, whether it's an attorney, whether it's a friend or a family member. And the more you go seeking, it's like pulling a little fiber on a sweater and it just begins to start unraveling. And that was my experience, is that at least in the medical community aspect of things, I watched time and time again, physician after physician, healthcare provider after healthcare provider look at me with like a blank stare, sometimes with fear in their eyes. They had no answers, none. And it was not only fear of like just having to witness what my family was going through, but it was also, I think they didn't have the awareness to admit it, that their training was at capacity. There was nothing from their training that they could draw on that was going to provide any kind of remedy or any kind of just help to ease some of the tragedy and tension that was in my life, the stress. I could see in their faces, whoa, that is way bigger than me. Almost, I can say metaphorically, but almost literally, they would be backing up to the door, right?
Yeah, they're like, whoa, this is too much.
Well,
Did you have faith to help you through this time, or were you like lost in the dark at that point still?
that's when spirit let me in my floundering around in the darkness, letting me figure out what faith was. But like that test that Mary was called to, a very similar journey of just having to believe, just having to, something inside me was knowing this was mine to do. And then, but going through cycles of, regardless of the vast amount of stress that the situation I was in was, I did have days of incredible strength because I felt spirit right there. Nothing from this world could help me. And that's part of the answer to the question you ask. In my experience, nothing from this world was going to solve the situation that I was in. And I didn't even know that I needed a solution. I just needed help. I just needed a fraction of the stress load to just come down a notch. Nothing could bring that stress level down even a millimeter. No one had an answer, but spirit did. And I could feel that calm presence. So the same energy that called me into this experience to say yes to something that I did say yes to was the same energy that would stand next to me when I was completely overwhelmed. And that's true for everybody. That's true for all of us. I don't know if you felt that. Let's flip it back to you. Did you feel spirit walking with you in your 15 years, or were you floundering?
Unfortunately, no. I was kind of in the dark. My lesson was one of surrender, for sure, but maybe not knowing surrendering to what. And I think that's part of the journey you alluded to earlier. It's this long journey. What's the point of it? I think it's to be able to experience everything any client might possibly. I've been through it all, and I can hold space for all of it because I've been there. I can have the empathy for what you're going through because I've probably been through it myself, or I can like relate to it in some way. So it's almost like I had to have such a long journey to prepare me. I almost also feel like the timing is preparing me for right now. It's like, okay, we're in training now for 20 years for this epic times we're in, and you need that much training. And then the faith is coming around at the very end. But I'm trying to actively cultivate faith right now in a connection to source, or source, God, creator, whatever. um and it's really starting to come in now. I'm like open spiritually now, and everything's arriving right when it needs to, in the perfect way now, finally getting that flow. But at the time, yeah, there's a lot of darkness. And it's also, yeah, you go to all the experts, they can't help you, and you realize there's no one in this world that can make you feel safe. You have to claim that for yourself at some point. um
That's part
and
of the surrendering, is knowing, like what I saw in the physicians. I don't know if you saw it in their faces too, but I saw that, look, this is way bigger than me.
yeah,
And then the human me was like, okay, well, I'll go find another doctor because somebody's going to have an answer.
right,
But some of us, mine was an extreme example, but everybody's living their own version of what we're both talking about. So it doesn't have to be severe or extreme. It can just be enough to make you uncomfortable. And when that discomfort leads you to realize that the people you're seeking out to just get a mirror or reflection, or to hear your story, or to have something that might help you with whatever that is, when no one has any of those answers, that's when you can pay attention and say, I think this is one of those awakening moments. When you go to several sources and it's not the source, it's not the ultimate source. That these are designed that on the horizontal line of our experience, on our human linear timeline, we've exhausted all messengers, all sources of potential help. That's when we have to go vertical. And that's where the peace that people describe that passes understanding comes. And I won't say mine came in a single event, because I was still dealing with something that was a 24/7 journey. So it was all day, every day, just like an illness would be in your own experience. It's like all day, every day, you're living with whatever this is at a high level of intensity.
yeah.
And that's when the surrender comes. And that's what spirit, I've said this in other podcasts, but I'll say it again. When I was in that, and I was in I call it the dark forest, right? When I was in the sea of confusion inside myself, trying to find faith, flickering in faith, faltering, getting back up, feeling faith again, and then slipping down the slippery slope again. I would say to the guides, because I had a connection at that point, and I'd say, how long must I suffer? Like, is this a lesson in suffering? I didn't know much biblically, but I know more of the story of Job now. Maybe that was akin to that story. Maybe I'm living out all the biblical timelines in this life experience. It felt like that. And I know people can relate. When you're past your capacity, when you're at the like penthouse moment, you've like gone to every level that you can go inside your humanness to deal with the situation you've got going on. And that's not enough. That is like stretching and stretching and stretching you beyond belief and beyond anything that you could ever have imagined. When we go through those experiences, I was saying, how much must I suffer, right? And how long will the suffering last? Of course, I was asking for timelines, and spirit always does a great way of managing that, to not necessarily give dates, because it's not, in spirit, it's not really tied to dates. It's tied to evolvement, growth. You vibrationally evolve your way into the next level of consciousness. They can't tell me what date that is, but they would say, I'd say, when will the suffering end? How long will the suffering last? And they would say, well, when you're ready.
Yeah, that's what just intuitively came to me. It's like, when are you going to choose for it to end? And it's not as simple as that, but it is eventually, but maybe not in the moment. Like, you try that, of course,
Right.
but then
I'm
you're
like,
like, well, I'm
okay,
not
so I'm
better.
ready. I'm ready
Yeah,
today.
but like, if you do it consistently, and there's a model for spirituality. I forget who did it, but it's like the victim, the victor, and the vehicle. Have you heard of that one?
No, I haven't.
So basically, these are ways to kind of tell where you're at vibrationally. So victims are at the low end of the emotional scale, like we talked about earlier. On your journey at the beginning, I mean, we're both victims. We're looking outside of ourselves for help. Like, who did this to us? Why did this happen to us? Who's going to save us? Then we move up to the victor stage, which is basically like, how can I take ownership and responsibility for my health? And how can I like be almost like the CEO of my own healing? And so that's a really huge leap. But then you tend to like still constantly seek an answer. And then finally, the vehicle stage is when you surrender, to God's plan or source's plan, and say, I will allow this to come through me. I'm going to surrender to it. And I think a great saying for this time period too is being at peace with what is. When you can learn to be at peace with what is and sit with the pain and just watch it and have some distance, give some space to it, eventually you're not resisting it all the time. So you stop energizing it, right? And recreating it constantly. And
Right.
so then you can just surrender it, let it go. And over time you get really good at that. And then you can kind of choose where you want to be, or certain areas of your life might be a different one of these phases. You might be a victim with finances, but you might be a victor with your career, and a vehicle, with like serving humanity or something, and allowing God to work through you. So
Oh, that's such a powerful, I don't know if I call it a container, but an illustration or a template to understand things. And when we're having thoughts in our heads, of course, wasn't even thinking about myself as the victim at the time, but totally.
right.
And then we flip I was trained in psychology. So in psychology terms, they would have called the victim as that external locus of control, right? That
Right,
everything
yeah.
outside of me is determining my life. And then it flips to that victor into the internal locus of control. And then that's where psychology, as far as I know, ends. And you get into spirituality, where you become the vehicle, you become the instrument who allows all of anything and everything to flow through you, but it doesn't stick. You're just in the experience of life. You're in your presence. And that's
Yeah.
where the power is. And I think that's also what happens if we go back to that energy of surrender. That's what the guides were indicating to me. Of course, they didn't give me those words. Spirit likes us to do the work. If they just give it to us, it's still a concept. They want it to be embodied by us, which is why they give us little breadcrumbs. They'll put little bumper pads around to, help us bounce off of, right? They'll put mirrors in our path of people we need to see things in ourselves from. But we are the ones that have to go the journey. We have to enter that journey. And in the hero's journey, if you use the language of Joseph Campbell, it's the same thing. We are living in this ordinary, kind of mundane, known world. And then the hero of their own story, which is all of us, right? All of us are summoned by this call to adventure. And that call to adventure is really to enter the unknown, enter a realm that's the mystery, the great mystery. And there's a much vaster you that you are there to rediscover, but you have to take the journey. You have to accept the call to come out the other side as the hero of your own story arc, who conquered those dragons and entered into that experience of the unknown. And I think what happens when we get to that place of surrender, when we become the vehicle, and there was a point in my journey, I couldn't believe I was saying it, but there was one day, it was as good a day as any other day. I don't even know the date, and you would think I would, but this is case in point with spirit. It wasn't the date that mattered, that on X date in X year, I was going to triumph over what I was suffering in, right? It wasn't about that. It was the moment in which I was ready. And I remember every vibration I felt on that day. I can close my eyes and feel it right now. I know the day where I was essentially physically on my knees, but spiritually on my knees, emotionally on my knees. But I was ready to lay it down. And I knew that this bigger vision for my life, that I couldn't see what it was. I just couldn't possibly see it. And I embodied what the doctors had in their faces, where this is bigger than me.
Yeah.
Nothing that I'm going to do, but I had to exhaust all the human things to get to a place of readiness to surrender and say, what were the 3 words that I said? I'm ready. I am ready. And I didn't know that I was even going to say those words. And I was like, I understand what they were saying, and simultaneously with the greatest grief and trauma and pain and suffering I was feeling. And at the same moment, there's this exhilaration, because in the letting down and letting go to the surrender frequency, it's not giving in. It's not saying I give up. No, surrender means there's a much bigger picture for this situation than I even know about, but I know it is far better than anything I can create on my own, because I'd already just witnessed myself do all of that.
Yeah.
And that's where I was failing. And not in a mistakes and perfect choices or that kind of duality. It was, I had to explore what the human me, the 3D side of me, was capable of doing. And when I had exhausted all of that, and it was exhausted, and I was exhausted, we get to a place where, wow, Spirit and God and Mother Earth and our helpers might be able to make this somehow easier. And in about 2 to 4 weeks from the moment I said I'm ready, the whole thing changed.
Yep.
The whole landscape and template of my life, everything changed for the better. But you couldn't have told me that 3 or 4 or 5 years earlier, right? I would never
Amazing.
have believed somebody if they said, okay, on X date, this is going to happen and you're going to do this thing. I just wouldn't have been able to even see it. And I think that's true of people in their lives right now and the growth that we're called to do. Some people can't even conceive of like a faith or spirituality or a being able to discern between truth with a capital T and lies or illusion or whatever we want to call that. A lot of people are like, yeah, how do you do that? Right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's a great segue into the nature of truth. And I was on a quest for absolute truth for a long time, and then one day I realized there is no such thing, or there's very few examples of things that are absolutely true. A great like way to illustrate this is, you and I could probably agree that it's like the sun is out right now, but for some people on this planet, the sun's not out. It seems like such a simple thing to agree on. Yet, like, our very experience of night and day is not like universally agreed on at any moment in time on this planet, right? So if we can't agree on if it's day or night, what can we agree on, right? So it's all really, when you start to see the world from that perspective of it's all relative to the observer and your experience, and especially all this programming too behind your experience. The same people can hear the same news broadcast and see completely different things depending on their level of perspective and their own life experiences. So
Right.
yeah, so this nature of truth, I think, is one of the things also that kind of is a bit of a gateway into some of the things we're talking about discerning, because then you start being exposed to different information and you're saying, okay, well, I think something's going on that doesn't add up. And so, like, what's the pathway, where are the tools to kind of look at each bit of information and say, like, is this just too crazy to even believe? And the powers that be will convince you that yes, in fact it is. um, One of the things that the media does is they gaslight constantly. They're totally, basically, the media and government are like an abusive narcissistic relationship, and so they use all the same tools of a narcissist and they project onto you what they do. They lie over and over and over again, but really loudly, and they just will not, like,
And it is
ever,
24/7. So there's
24/7.
no time that you're not hearing it.
Yeah. And they'll just keep saying it regardless of any, like, it's basically like science, right? It's like you keep saying science, but then when you're censoring all the scientists,
Right.
it's like, what does that say about you? So, and that's what's so frustrating about people that are awake, is when they see the propaganda so obviously for what it is,
Yes.
but other people see it as they're still in the
As
victim state where
science.
they're just trusting the message, right?
Right.
So the mainstream media is probably one of the biggest messages. The white lab coat message, right, as well. That's where right now that's what's happening on the planet. I think there's some studies done where they had a guy in a white lab coat basically a doctor, tell people to do this experiment where they would shock another person in another room, and they would start hearing this other person scream and scream, and the doctor eventually would say, turn it up to this point, and I think it said lethal or something on this dial, and the doctor ordered the person to turn it up to that point. People were crying in tears, but they did it anyways because a doctor told them to do this to another person. So we wonder how we can get into, like, the state we're in right now. That's how, is because people have been so deeply programmed to trust authority that when put into a position like that, their brains just cannot make sense of it. So logical thought gets turned off, and we rely on these belief systems that were programmed into us since birth, basically. So
and can I just say one thing really quick, because you're doing such an amazing job, and I don't want you to lose your train of thought, so hold that feeling. Just quickly, it's that external locus of control, and we're reinforced early on, kids looking externally, and then our world says, yes, you should look externally to your teacher for the A or the sticker on your paper, or it's all these subtle messaging systems that are pretty holistic, So it turns out wherever you turn, your church, your school, your parents, your family, your friends, they're all mirroring that same message that you have to look outside yourself to get the information you need to know if you're okay. And that's that lab coat scenario, but it starts very early, not with the lab coat. We all go to the doctor when we're kids too, but other things, it's all these other ways of like, yes, you did okay in school today. You get your happy little star. Right.
And then you feel good. And it's like this positive reinforcement, like by following the rules. Government's doing it now too. It's like the government will save you and tell you what to do and protect you. If we all would do what's in our best interest individually, it would also cascade to be in the best interest of everyone.
Right.
So, if we give away all of our responsibility and just want to be taken care of, where will that lead down the road? Right. That won't lead to a good place. Because, then we'll just be victims of whoever wants to control the situation. Right. So,
right.
So that's kind of what some of the ways we kind of get into these situations. Some of the tools, probably the first tool of discernment is personal experience, right? It's like, what is my personal experience? And you have to be awake and consciously looking at your experience and, on all numbers of levels, right? Because that can say, hey, this is true for me. Like if I touch this hot stove, that was hot. Right. Now I know that I can discern that stoves are hot because I felt it, right?
Right.
Majority of stuff most of the stuff we know, we think we know, we have zero personal experience with. Someone told us, or it's in a book somewhere, but it's never been personally verified at all. Right. And so that leads to this idea of, what if there's a bigger world going on that we don't know? Like, what if we have no idea what reality really is? And so you've had a lot of spiritual experiences, but someone that's really closed off hasn't had those yet. So It's like, do we just trust the people that are saying like there's angels and fairies and all this other stuff when we haven't had that personal experience ourselves?
And that's harder to believe than the conditioning we've been given for many years, which is the science, which is the expert, right? So here we are, we could talk about crystals and fairies and angel guides and all of that, but that's much less proven. This path of bigger vision is much less proven than the other. It's contrast, right? Yeah.
And personal experience makes it so easy to have discernment because, hey, this is what's true for me. But even then, it's not always true. Like there's all kinds of experiments where you think you're seeing something, but you're not even having the experience that you think you're having. So when you start to realize these things, you can say, okay, you know what? What if I don't know anything? And what if I just allow for like the bigger, like just allow space for anything to exist and not have to constantly control it. Just like maybe I don't have to. Not have to know. It's like that might be possible. If it someday comes to be true, that'd be kind of cool. It's like, hey, I thought about that. I made space for that eventuality, but I don't have to like go around tell everyone like this is true or convincing myself. It's just like I've made space for it to be a possibility. Another thing is like curious observation of our world is another way to like foster discernment. It's like just kind of look around and say, what's going on? As opposed to check it out instead of, and starting to notice like where the programming comes from, starting to notice subtleties, looking at things from different perspectives. So I was like, I told you I was watching like Saturday Night Live, and there was like a skit about like basically like cannibalism. I was like just blown away that this is like being normalized so much, but
with
people are
laughter.
watching it with laughter. So you're like, oh, everyone's laughing. This must be okay. And it's on the mainstream network. It must be okay. But then when you can take a step back and say, that's sick and totally wrong. Why is this on TV?
Right.
Then when you kind of make it to that point, you can really start to see things a lot more clearly. And then you don't get fooled by it anymore. You can make your own enlightened choices about what to believe.
But admitting to yourself and having enough of a awareness to allow yourself to know I'm really uncomfortable with that. I think even what you just said, that may be more people's experience. That example that you just gave, there's something on the TV that's the lab coat as metaphor that I trust, that they're putting out something, and that really makes me uncomfortable. But people would have to just have just a moment. It's like a pause. It could be 10 seconds instead of letting the screen continue on with the story or the vignette or whatever it was. and acknowledging to yourself, wait, something about that isn't right. And then you start, the next time you turn on that particular show, you have a visceral memory of that. And you watch another skit that they're doing. You're like, oh, that was off too. And you
start to a new lens. Yeah.
You start to clue in to say, gosh, how long have I been watching this show? And you start asking questions. Was it always like this? Was I not paying attention that they did this 5 years ago? Right. Or is it new that they're covering these topics or making these things funny that aren't funny? Right. There's, and I haven't talked about this anywhere, but it's like there's a code inside us that knows that that's not okay. It like that goes back to the Cain and Abel biblical story right there. Cannibalism as an example of joking. It's like if they did that and somebody wanted to do a funny skit of Cain killing Abel, right? And his brother, and in the way there's lots of people, I'm sure, who interpret what that means and how he did it and all of that. But if we just look at the basic structure of the story, one brother killing another brother out of jealousy and, you know, some dark storms brewing inside them, that killing was justified. We know from these biblical stories or in other sacred texts, other religions, like killing is not a human thing to do. It's not it happens, but something happens where those light codes inside us light up to say that crossed a line. And where humanity's been conditioned and through propaganda and all these things for all these years, especially with television, because we've had all kinds of media in other centuries of time, but ours is very compelling because you can, like, I can get up really close to my screen here. You can get sucked into the matrix and not even really notice that it's happening, but something will happen and you'll get the red pill and it'll wake you up. You're going to say, whoa, that crossed a line. And where's that line? It's you. You are the line. Something inside you says that's not funny, or that can't be real. Like that was so bizarre.
Right.
And then you look deeper at your screen and, and then there's like the movie Truman Show, where, do you remember that movie with,
yeah, of course.
Yeah. I think the light from the set like falls from the sky,
literally
in his driveway or something. And he's like, whoa, right? That would be like a satellite falling on our head or something. And, but after you have an experience like that, you're just kind of looking around and like, is the world that I live in every day, is it what I think it is? And it was earth shattering or life shattering. I was already in a shattered state because of the tragedy my family was going through, my dark night of the soul that was mine to live and mine to transcend. And people have talked about that word transcend, which is transcend, ending the trance. It ended the trance of the illusion that I had been living. And so that's that feeling. It was life shattering. But as your life shatters, what people don't also realize, and maybe it won't shatter for some people, maybe it'll just be uncomfortable and get increasingly uncomfortable. We all have a spectrum of experience and responses. But whatever that discomfort is for you, and something is changing, and you can no longer see the shows you used to watch, the news you used to watch, the conversations you used to have, you're kind of watching yourself like the Truman Show, like, whoa, am I living in a matrix? And is this matrix real? Is this illusion real? Or is it a narrative and a structure, a planetary structure that wants us to look and think and be a certain way? Because it needs our consent. It needs our participation to make the whole engine work. And I know we're going to talk about some other things, but I think we are not just at the precipice. Some of us have already leapt off the precipice into the mystery, that hero that's left the known world and said, I do commit. It's called crossing the threshold. The hero in their journey gets invited to the adventure, is checking it out. Some people turn back and say, thank you, but I'm going back to my nice little house, my nice little job, and I'm not going to take that journey. And this time on the planet, I think something will happen. Well, either a laser will strike your house and you don't have that house anymore, or your job will just get eliminated and you don't have the job. You can't go back to your ordinary world. COVID has done that for many people. We can't go back to what we thought would always keep us safe and small and tucked in and secure.
100% agree. Like there's no going back. It's like enough events have already happened, but more are going to happen. Like the old systems are literally destroying themselves. And, it's like, it's so elegant the way God works too, is that he's allowing them to destroy themselves, because
Right.
it's like the most efficient way for this to happen. And I keep getting the imagery of a snake eating its own tail. It's pretty much
Yes. Isn't
what's
that the
happening.
Ouroboros? Is that, have you heard that
Yeah, I think
term?
so.
Yes.
So that's what's happening right now. And I also get like the imagery of like a child playing this chess game that's already decided. He knows he's lost, but he's just going to flip the board up and create chaos, and all the pieces are going to fall. We're the pieces, unfortunately, and we have to suffer through this experience of a tantrum, like when you've already lost, and that's the shame. So that's where responsibility keeps coming back in. That you've given messages of preparation and taking responsibility for your own life, and for your own beliefs and your own values. And if you don't know these things yet, now is the time to explore these things. We all got a big dose of that at the beginning of the pandemic. Like everything that's been happening, it's been serving both the light and the dark. You can use it for whatever you want. A lot of people have used it for good internal exploration. A lot of people woke up at that point too, and more are doing so. This kind of leads us into a little bit into like some of these other ideas. So like we talked a lot about more like societal level systems, belief, observation and personal experience. Now, like let's move to more of like the embodiment and the
Mm.
spiritual sides of this. So gut instinct is a really great way to discern truth. So you read something and you have a visceral reaction in your body. Like I love when I get these like amazing tingles and I just like know something's like divinely true. And sometimes you get this horrible sick feeling, like get away from this, whatever it is.
Yes.
What's your experience with that kind of
Yeah,
embodied
it's the
feeling?
same. It's exactly like intuition. You can call it your gut instinct because we all have one. We all know those
Yeah,
feelings of like something about this person just kind of is creepy.
doesn't feel
That
right. Yeah.
creepy feeling doesn't feel right. I'm really uncomfortable. Early on, when I would be in situations working for companies right out of college, not the best companies, they would do things to some of our clients or our employees or whatever that would make me supremely uncomfortable. And my
Yeah.
response to that, as an empath who didn't know she was an empath then, I would be sweating inside, like this heat would come through my
Wow.
body, and I would
Yeah.
know something is not okay with how they just treated that person. And this is from like the top down. And when you see enough choices being made about that. So I learned like this internal heat, this fire. Oh, that was a big indication because you can't avoid that. And that those gut instincts, allowing my emotions, that's a big thing because a lot of people in the conditioning of our world have been conditioned to distract themselves from pain. So a little kid's crying, they've just fallen down, and the mom goes to pick them up kindly and lovingly and says, let's go get an ice cream cone. When a scenario, and of course there's an appropriate time for that, but if that's your whole childhood, that every time something bad happens, somebody's offering you the distraction, don't look at that, look over here. We've learned very early on to negate our own emotional guidance system, our own intuitive guidance system. So I think that's very powerful. So you asked me, how do I sense that inside myself? I've always sensed it at some level because I never could disconnect myself from my emotions. But people that have successfully, really disconnected and feel more muted down in their life right now, that's probably a process of some tools, maybe another podcast, but just to be aware, to allow yourself to be aware. I don't think I'm feeling things as fully as other people feel them. And maybe I need to pause and get curious about that.
Yeah, that numbness comes in, and our whole society is structured to help us distract ourselves from, like Eckhart Tolle talks about, the pain body. Like
Mm.
we've have an entire lifetime of building up this pain body of physical emotional pain. We can't sit with ourselves for even a second. It's too painful, so we're just constantly trying to distract ourselves with everything on TV, internet, games, pornography, drinking, drugs, like whatever
All
people
the
do,
vices, right?
all the vices, and they push that on us and say, here's the solution to the pain that we've caused. And so it's really hard. It's like it's not an easy thing to like go the other direction, to sit with yourself, to be with your body that's just suffering, and to learn to love yourself. That's really,
Yeah.
kind of the next step. What you're talking about is to just nurture and be with your body and have a willingness to sit through that pain and to
And
uh,
listen.
listen to it and surrender to it and be okay with it. And over time, eventually it dissolves and you can start to feel these joyous feelings in your body again. But it's not an easy journey, and it's one that has to be consciously undertaken. But so that's definitely part of that journey. And you might not get the gut instincts, you might not get those physical embodied feelings until you've done that journey. But a lot of us, when it's something really strong happens, like we know, like, oh, this is just totally wrong, get the hell out of here, or something like that. Or
even if somebody did what you did when you were watching the skits on Saturday Night Live, just by hearing a podcast like this, say they've got those muted down emotions and they're a little numbed out and they use those vices, just say, I don't know what they're talking about, but maybe I'll watch the commercials I watch. Like, what are they really selling?
Right.
What is the news really telling? What is that skit really normalizing? What are they doing? And if you ask yourself the question, say, I don't think what's happening is what they're saying on the podcast, meaning you and me, or anybody else that's talking about stuff like this. Just ask yourself deeper questions and you'll start to see things deeper than even a layer deeper than you did before.
Yeah, you'll have that personal experience of seeing it for yourself. I heard some guy talking about all this like one eye symbolism,
Right.
And I went to like the magazine rack and I saw it like all over the place on all the popular magazines.
Not even on our radar screen. We don't even have any awareness of that.
Yeah. So it's like, what's going on?
Yeah, somebody once told me about that example, and I don't know if it's true. I've never researched it and found it, but something like the Native Americans, when the Europeans were coming over, and people think like, how did they not know they were going to get attacked, right? How did they allow that to happen? And I know in the stories that I've heard about that example, I should look that up. They'd never seen ships like that before. So it's like they couldn't even see them on the horizon, even though they were right there. They couldn't see them until they were on their shores. Literally, they couldn't see them coming all the way from that great distance. Slowly, like ships come, right?
Does not compute.
It did not compute. They had no file. A friend of mine, Renee, who podcasts in some of the roundtables and with me, Renee Tainter, talks about if you don't have a file in your belief system, if you don't have a way to receive that new information, it just gets kicked right back out. So the same thing, that's how propaganda, if there's no way, a landing place for it to land inside any of your belief system, your system at some level is going to say, eject file, right?
Yeah, it doesn't make sense.
Doesn't make sense. And people do that. And I think people who go on the spiritual journey, the hero's journey, they engage some kind of awakening with themselves. They not only do what you said earlier, which is, I don't know what I don't know. You admit that you don't know. You're willing to see things that you don't know, and you're willing to be shown things that you may not even believe, but you could admit that you don't know about them. And more of the things like you said about the eye or whatever, or the skits, or you just start looking around yourself like Truman in the Truman Show to say, whoa,
whoa, what's going on?
What's going on here?
Yeah.
And it's amazing what you see when you didn't see it an hour or a minute before, and it clicks. And once you see things, it's the thread in the sweater. It just starts to unravel more and more. And then once you realize like 5 things, 10 things, whatever it is, right? You're like, whoa, what else do I think is true in my perception of truth that may not be true at all, or I might have a skewed version of the truth. That's more likely the truth for a lot of people. I may have a skewed version of the truth. That's a big thing to admit.
This is a great segue into the next place, is then people go looking for answers again outside themselves because they're back to being victims and they're like, I don't know. So they go looking for trusted sources. So they know they can't trust the mainstream media anymore. And so now they're like, okay, well, let's find a blogger or a podcaster or whatever. And, this visceral body reaction to that person is one way to tell if you can trust them. The second way is to look at like what they talk about and then see if there's contradictions, logical fallacies, things like that. Or if they say something that you definitely don't believe and is not true from personal experience, yet they say it's true. So that's a good example. And then sometimes you still say, you know what, I'm going to not throw that entire person's whole thing out, even though I know they're totally wrong on this one thing. And then sometimes later you start to say, you know what, I'm actually open to that thing that they said is true. One of my biggest like secondary awakenings was watching Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind by David Greer about extraterrestrials and stuff. And while watching it, I had this visceral feeling of love for these ETs that are visiting our planet. And so from going from being gaslit for like decades about ETs are not real, which is what I just believed,
Right.
then now all of a sudden the same people that told us that are now saying, yeah, they are real. And, you know, and we need to go to war with them, basically.
Right.
You
A
know,
new narrative about the new thing. Right.
yeah. So like we need a new enemy and a whole new thing. So we have to start seeding that into the public's mind. And the great thing about all this discernment too is you can start to see when they start projecting what's coming in advance, because you know there's always a lot of, you know, setting up the
They
narrative
set
in
the
advance.
stage, right?
Yeah.
Just like you would as a good
Predictive
storyteller.
programming
Right.
and whatnot. So yeah, so watching this and feeling that visceral like love for like, wow, there's like higher dimensional, you know, beings, you know, coming to this planet to visit us, and it's all done through higher consciousness, and it ties in elegantly with everything we know about spirituality and human connection and all this stuff, and like that's even how they're called here, right? So I'm like, wow, this is fascinating. And that just opened the door to like, what else is real? So my consciousness went from like being stuck in this sick body to like like universal consciousness all of a sudden. And then it dropped back down to global consciousness, where it's like, what the heck is going on this planet? So for like a few months, I just looked at it all, and I was just overwhelmed at times. I felt physically sick and all this
It's
darkness
a
and stuff.
lot to hold.
It is. So you
your
have to do it
awareness.
very slowly. Don't feel like you have to like, you know, like take all this in all at once. You can take it in a little bit at a time and find trusted people, you know, like friends and stuff, maybe that are curious as well or have researched some of the stuff. And hopefully a podcast like this will really help, you know, people that have done some of that research and trying to filter through what might be true, what might not be true. And a lot of it's in service of alerting people in advance that if any of these things do come true, are you prepared for it, you know, mentally, spiritually, and physically, right?
And people, I always like to relate it to a story character or a biblical character, but you have to think about, you know, we think about these characters like, oh, it was just Harry Potter had to go through that, or oh, it was just Luke Skywalker, or oh, it was just Noah. You know, that couldn't possibly happen in my timeline or my lifetime. And they also have done a good job of these stories of like, you know, that happens in one hero in just a handful of movies. And that's not really the case for everybody. No, we will all face those dragons. We will all face some villain or something that needs to help break us out of our illusion. And so I think about what you're talking about too is the growing our faith, the growing our discernment, the practicing of these skills and tools. It happened gradually over time where we did look deeper. We were willing to say from like, I know everything to maybe I know nothing. It doesn't have to be quite that contrast, but I'm willing to look deeper. Even if you can just say that, I'm willing to look deeper. I'm willing to be shown. If there's another version that I need to be seeing, I actually say it as a prayer to spirit, show me. If I need to be seeing something else about this, show me. And that's with a heart, at least inside me, full of faith, but for you, a willing faith and a prayer that says, I am willing to be shown. Please show me. Show me what's the next thing I need to know so I can come more into my wholeness, right? Because that's the ultimate thing, is to be free, to free ourselves from these little selves that we believed is all that we are. It's
Absolutely.
powerful. It's powerful.
It is, yeah. I think that the systems have tried to keep us in this little self, and as we realize we're just these expansive, powerful, you know, like in your most recent podcast about the swan, we're not ugly ducklings, we're the swans. So
Right, we're the swans.
and we need to own that. So this kind of leads us, when we, you know, are still back in that victim state with these trusted external sources. You talked about intuition. So now I kind of separate that from the physical embodiment of the gut instinct, the physical feelings. Then there's this intuitive information that just shows up. Where does it come from? It's like, does it come from God, source creator? Does it come from something else? You know, and you have to be discerning about that too. If you hear voices in your head, sometimes it's like bad voices potentially too. You know, it depends where you're at in your journey. If you're in a very bad place, you might be attracting, you know,
lower experiences, right?
Yeah. So intuition, higher guidance from higher sources, either channeled like in your experience, or preferably a direct connection with try to foster that connection with God, or sometimes it just shows up. It's like a knowing. This, I find that this and the body are the two things that give you really good information. That stuff is like
stellar.
gold. You listen,
like
like when you have that compared to your conscious thoughts or like what the
beliefs.
news is telling you, you listen to your body and you listen to this higher intuition. How would you say soul sight differs from intuition and from this higher guidance?
I don't know that it differs. I think it's a deeper extension of it, because it's through our intuition, which is all of our energy bodies trying to sync up and coordinate as one guidance system inside us, that comes through the lenses through which we look. So when we're not open to our own intuition and we've turned off our guidance system, then we don't have the soul sight. We have 3D human sight, which is coming from a linear playing field, which is you can only see what you were given and told and sold and all those things, right? But once you activate this intuition, if you have the physical sensations in your body, which is the heat, the sweat, the gut feelings, the ooh, that doesn't feel good, those are the physical visceral sensations. And then you have the intuitive senses that activate, that it's the knowing without knowing, it's the feeling without feeling, it's the prescience, and then it's also that energy is alive. You thought about getting a cup of coffee, you ran late, you never got the cup of coffee, and one of your friends shows up at work, is like, hey, I was just thinking about you, I brought some coffee. Right? When you see your thoughts materialize into things, that's another, to me, it's just another aspect of how your intuitive senses, you knew you were going to have a cup of coffee, whether you were creating having a cup of coffee or you were presciently knowing that somebody was bringing it. All those energetics inside you were conspiring in the best way of conspiring to bring to you the things that you're desiring. And when you have that, and those things go from thought forms and vibrations inside you of desire, and there's or fears that attract just as powerfully. Your greatest fear shows up in your life too. We manifest that as well. And when we can say, God, and not everybody understands this who would be listening to this podcast, but some will. When things show up in our experience, however unpleasant, we can know, I created that. I was a vibrational match to that thing somewhere, somehow. So when we start to expand our picture of seeing our life and us inside the life we're living, that we're inhabiting a certain vibration, and that is consistently bringing to us that which we're thinking and feeling about. When we make that conscious connection, like I thought about the coffee, there's the coffee. I thought about getting a raise and a raise was offered. I was afraid of losing my job and I lost my job. When you start to see the things that you are thinking about and feeling about show up as an experience in your life, and you're like, God, I was just thinking that and now it's here. Then that starts to come through the lenses, your soul sight of how you see. And when you start realizing that you're a big picture creator, you can be this, we are all designed to be these conscious creators. Then we can expand our bigger picture vision to say, well, if I know that I'm creating, whether it's unpleasantness or greatness, and I can choose what I want to create, then I start looking through soul vision. I'm willing to see the uncomfortable stuff on the planet because I'm also willing to see that I am part of manifesting that to clear off this planet. I'm part of also visioning bigger beyond that darkness. So I'm visioning the darkness falling away and leaving existence forever, like being dematerialized by God. And I'm also manifesting, if those things don't define me from an intuitive, I'm talking now like a bigger picture answer to your question, but I'm just saying from that intuitive place. And once we know we're these creators and we can feel the vibrational reality of that, then we're also starting to project through ourselves the earth we want to live in, the country we want to live in, with the leaders we want to be leaders, and the friends we want to have, and the family we do love around us. And we're living in a greater resonance with ourselves, and things are just so much easier. So I think soul sight is an extension of cultivating our intuition.
Right. It sounds like it's all these levels, including an energetic resonance, which is another thing about discernment too, which is a little hard to define, but you just did a great job of like saying like this is a major piece that the truth almost finds us, or we can resonate or not resonate. a lot of times when people like decide to buy a package or like a program online, they'll just resonate with it. They'll know they resonate with it and they're ready to go. If they don't and they're logically thinking about it, that's probably not a good fit,
They're
right?
just completely miss
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
Yeah. And you talked about how we attract negative stuff too. I think a lot of that is just the toxic energy soup of this world that's been created by the powers that be. We're attracting that collective consciousness of negativity if we don't choose actively to do something else. So you talked about all these beautiful things about attracting a bright, awesome future, but it takes conscious energy and effort to turn away from the horror show and create
Right.
something new, and that's what's happening right now. But yeah, it's not necessarily easy. You have to develop those skills to do that.
And
And
with hand in hand with discernment and cultivating these skills also goes discipline. I don't know if we use
yeah,
that word, but that's one of the
we haven't
tools
yet.
is to
No.
discipline yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true. The other thing with the attraction too is that people get frustrated because they're like, okay, well, I said I wanted this. You might even said it out loud or wrote it down or whatever, watch The Secret or whatever. I think it's because we have very little power and we're not like present in the present moment because of this pain that we talked about earlier. And we just haven't developed ourselves spiritually. We haven't cleansed our bodies and cleansed ourselves emotionally, dealt with all of our traumas and emotions from the past. And as we do that work, our manifestations happen like a lot quicker. Like Jesus, if he wanted something, it happened instantly because he was an instant manifester. It might take us 4 months to manifest something, and then we don't make the connection because
Right.
it took too long. But as you do this healing work, deep healing work on yourself on all levels of being, especially energetically, at some point you become this bright, beautiful, vibrant person that when things start attracting to that very quickly, and then you start to notice it. So celebrating little small things, like you said, someone bringing you a cup of coffee, or I went to my coffee shop and they gave me two $1 coupons. So one of them I gave back to them and used it that day and gave them $1 tip extra. And then I took the
Oh,
other one for me. So it's like a
right.
win-win.
Right.
And I feel like, okay, well, I'm going to celebrate. Wow, I just got $2
Right.
off coffee, and one went to help the person that serves me every day, which is amazing. So I spread it around.
So awesome. And that came from your guidance system too, that you were feeling good. You could feel in your body, it felt good to
Yeah.
respond in that way. It's incredibly the world when we talk about life being magical, even in a time like this, for some people, life is still truly miraculous. And
Yeah.
some people are not having that experience. A lot of people are not. But if you want to begin to touch some of that, have that coffee experience and those coupons touch you where you just feel like a joy inside yourself and you feel that win-win exchange, right? And you know
Mm.
the universe is supporting you and playing with you, not in a toying with you in a bad way, but in a like they like to delight you. The universe likes to conspire to give you things that will delight you. That's part of living in the
I
realm that we
love it.
live in, right? And
That's an
so,
invitation for a great day for whoever's watching this.
right.
Go out with that attitude.
How does the universe want to delight me today? And how
Yeah.
can I be an instrument and a conduit of that energy for myself and others? It's a
Love
great
it. Oh
question to
man,
ask,
beautiful.
right? So
Yeah.
awesome. But a lot of people, because they're rehearsing instead what the news just said, what the bad news they just got at the doctor, the bad news or what they just heard about their company and layoffs that are
Mm.
coming for them. And they keep churning that story. And I just want to go back because it's some of the basics of being a creator of your life and this intuition and all the parts of us working together. Typically people are unconscious creators, so they're churning these negative thoughts, not realizing that that's their wand that's creating their world, right? And if they're thinking it and they are naturally frustrated or scared of what they're talking about, they activated their emotional body not even realizing that they did that. And
Power.
when
Yeah.
you have your thoughts and your energy field and your heart working together, you are a powerful creator whether you know it or not. So that person who's just still replaying the really unpleasant conversation with their brother, their mother, sister, boss, whoever it was, and it caused some distress inside them, and then they go tell somebody else, and then later that night somebody says, how was your day? And they replay it again and again. They're recreating that they're going to have another scenario of what that just was again and again. So they go to the coffee shop, but there's no coupons for them.
Right.
Sorry,
And they're
I
sold
got
out of your favorite beverage.
exactly. They say, but I heard that everybody else was getting coupons. You got no coupons for me because they were
Right.
already feeling low and down and a victim of the universe. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, because of their vibration, they got there. The timing was such that they just gave out their last coupon to the guy walking out the door. Sorry, we don't have any more. And they're like, you know,
And that makes it even worse for the next day for them. So.
and then they tell people I had this terrible day and then I didn't even get the coffee coupon. And then they tell everybody else that. And then that creates more the experience of not getting what you need, not being blessed with the magic, not experiencing the miracles. And I was in a spiraling time period in my life that same time. I was learning at that same time, developing faith. I was also learning about the difference between complaining and venting. I would let myself have time to vent my frustration. I'd give myself 10 minutes, or I'd write in my journal. I'd give myself an hour to journal. I didn't have that kind of time then, but let's just say I had an hour to journal. I would let myself have it, but I would know I was venting, and I would consciously say to myself, I'm just getting this out. It has to go somewhere. Because if I keep it in here, I'm going to keep it going as a story vibrationally. So I let myself vent, and then I would visualize more of the outcomes. It took 5 years. Like this was not a couple of months. It took 5 years because it took me that long to be ready.
Yeah.
So
yeah. That's a really great thing. That's why we do create this, and you gave the example of how we spread it around, so we're like constantly almost polluting the energy by complaining about how bad things are,
right. We can bless the energy or an environment, or we can pollute it.
And which feels better to you? Like I know people are like, fake it till you make it, oh that's just fake or whatever, but it's like, well, you're consciously creating your experience. It's like, well, this feels better than that. Dr. Joe Dispenza talks about this, where like we wake up every morning and we create the same day by complaining about what happened yesterday, the first thoughts in our head. So when you wake up in the morning, you have those thoughts, say, you know what, oh yeah, I heard, Dr. Joe talked about this, or Matt or Marie talked about this. Stop, to stop that pattern. Say, like, how will the universe delight me today, or what am I grateful for is a much better way to start your day.
Yes.
Or feeling, maybe spend 30 seconds trying to feel a connection to source or God, or just breathing, coming back into your body, or whatever it is. I'm
grateful for like a brand new day. I just even have gratitude just that today's a brand new day.
Today's a brand new day.
I'm so blessed, right? I'm so blessed.
Yeah.
Even on the days that I don't feel that way, I still say it because I set the intention that I'm willing to be blessed, even if I'm not feeling blessed. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. Well, I think we had one big tool that we wanted to share today.
Please.
So the idea of this whole podcast came from this idea of this 3-bucket tool for discernment. And so I wanted to share that with people. As you start, like going out there and looking for information, you start to find out a lot of stuff that you're like, there's no way that's true. Maybe that's true. I'm not sure if that's true. I really hope that's not true. And I think we might be hearing a lot of this stuff over the next, weeks, months, and even years, where we're going to be really challenged if we haven't considered some of these things. So I came with this model of the 3-bucket theory, where there's bucket 1, bucket 2, bucket 3. It's really simple. Right. You might hear something like, you might watch, like hear about extraterrestrials, watch Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind. You're like, there's no way this is true. I'm going to put that in bucket 3. I don't believe in ETs. That's just so far out there. Then you might hear something else that's a little bit easier to believe, like, wow, the Federal Reserve is charging us interest on creating our own money, like the people, and basically taxing the people to death. Is that true? I think that's probably true. So I'm going to put that into bucket number 1. And so, and then bucket number 2 might be something in the middle, where like, I'm not quite so sure. Do fairies exist? Maybe they do, maybe they don't. Let's put that in bucket number 2 and we'll see. Like, I'm open to the idea, but maybe I haven't seen enough, like evidence of such. And I think having a willingness to let things move between the buckets is good too. But it's basically a triage system that allows you to, instead of having all this ambiguousness and all this doubt and all this confusion, what if you can just say, you know what, I'm just going to like surrender this idea to bucket number 3 and say, okay, I've considered it. I've made space for it, but I don't have to necessarily say it's true or convince people of it or whatever, or even change anything in my life. But when you start to see a lot of things in bucket number one start overflowing,
Oh,
it's like, what can I do in the real world to help create this new world that Maria is talking about, instead of just being a victim to like all this stuff in bucket number one. So yeah, so that's a way to triage some of this new information you get until you get better and better at discerning. So hopefully it's helpful to some people.
that's so incredibly helpful. And as you were describing it this time, and I want to review that one more time because I interrupted you and I might have made it a little more confusing between 1 and 2. So we'll do that again. But it's like, I'm not a very organized person, but I know people who are organized. And by association, I hope I learned some things from them. And people have filing systems, those like trays where you can have like the inbox, the outbox, and something in between, right? Things that are kind of in a holding pattern for further information, right? I kind of look at it's like it can be, and like we equate that to the filing system that Renee Tainter talks about, that if we don't have a file for it, it's going to hop right out. We're just going to kick it out. If we can see that in your bucket system, or another way to see it is maybe this filing system, something like that, that's a 3-tiered system, that the first is likely something you are going to be dealing with. It's likely true. It may seem a little out there, but it can be in that bucket number 1, and you're willing to work with it, and it's feeling more true than not true. And so you're going to address those things. That's going to get attention first. And then the second one is like, I don't know if that's true. I don't know what to do with that. It could be true. It needs further investigation. That to me is what you're saying is bucket number 2, is it needs further. I need more energy to deal with that. I need more time.
Or maybe like, I just don't, more evidence even. Like, I don't believe it's true necessarily.
Right.
But it might be true. Like, there's a little doubt. Like, yeah, that might be true.
Might be true. And then the third bucket, you're kind of saying, is so far out there, I don't even know what to do with that. Is that kind of that third bucket of like, I'm just going to leave it there and suspend judgment. I'm just going to let it until it's proven to be true or not true.
Right. Like, here's a good example. Like, will the internet be shut down by some group?
Okay.
It's certainly something that should probably appear in one of these 3 buckets, right?
Right.
And also there's a bit of a likelihood at some point will this happen, or to some degree. Yeah, we've seen showing that this could happen. We've seen news stories like, oh, there's geostorms hitting the world that might take down the internet. Like, they tell you in advance again, and that the internet went down. You're like, oh yeah, it's those geostorms, So then you're like, well, what's the truth behind this story? Is it just geostorms that they knew about in advance that definitely are going to take down the internet, or is it something else, right? So, and then sometimes you just like don't want it in any of the 3 buckets. You're like, you know what, that is not part of my reality. I'm not even going to consider it. But I wouldn't necessarily say it's like what you're suggesting, that everything has to constantly move between the buckets, but I find that they naturally move when you're ready. So something might move up to a bucket number 2 if you find some new information out, or it might go the other direction. But I find it's very obvious. It just happens. You're like, oh yeah. And sometimes it's kind of between the buckets. You're like, it's trying to move here. And it's not like you're consciously trying to move it. You're just allowing it to move if you're like, that's more likely. I heard one person say once that 1/3 of all conspiracy theories are true and 2/3 are not true. And that's kind of what led me to this idea. I'm like, well, that makes a lot of sense. Like, let's get the stuff in bucket number 1 and figure out which ones are true. And then the other 2 are actually just people being very sensational, and it's probably not true, but it might be true, and you still have to consider it. So.
Well, and what you just said, that last statement, is like, it might be true and we still should consider it. I think my personal belief, the only way we're really going to free ourselves from any kind of false matrix or illusion, or ways that we limit ourselves or cause ourselves pain because we're running patterns we don't know are there, or maybe we know they're there, but we don't know what to do with them. I find that bringing the light to those things is what tends to bring the solution, even if it's a 5-year journey to get to that point. Or I'll give an example. I've just been feeling that my dogs needed a different foods, and I've been very conscious. Everything that I buy for them is a very conscious decision. I don't just like go to the store and buy like the dog food that's on sale. I'm somebody who like always consciously shop for them, but I can tell even what I've been doing, their needs are different. So number 1, I'm feeling that. I'm feeling it inside. The intuition is there saying, yes, there's something to what you're feeling. Keep allowing that. That's what I felt, is like, I don't know, because I've done so much research on dog food over the years, I could tell you. And I didn't know where else I was going to be going, but I couldn't perceive. It wasn't coming to me yet. I think it was a bigger deal to let me kind of go off grid from what even anything that I was thinking. And I'll just shorten the story up to say that maybe I got that nudging like 3, 4, 5 months ago. And so several months have passed, but every time I'm feeding them, I'm like, oh yeah, I wonder what that's going to be, but I don't know what it is. And then information came, the guidance was to get on the computer and do a little search, right? But I was searching specifically for something with one of my dogs. I can't remember what it was. I think she's got more arthritis. So that led me searching, and these natural supplements and things came up, that including some CBD and some things like that for dogs. Wow. And that was like all the testimonials were how much it helped with their pain. And I thought, ding, 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 ding. And then I followed what those people were doing. You read the comments, you learn a lot in comments. You can learn a lot about if people are resonating with this person. There's always trolls on just about anything, sure, the naysayers. But if you can look at the majority of the energy, is this working for people or is this not working for people? Do they resonate? Do they not resonate? And boy, I just changed up everything that I was doing with their food. And I did get that CBD oil. And just like that website said, in like 5 to 20 minutes, my dog stopped like moaning in the pain she just had started expressing. It was amazing. Yeah. And I felt it about 5 months ago, her pain, and something was shifting, but it took her getting louder the last 3 or 4 weeks, showing me that she was moving slower, that I paid even deeper attention, was like, okay, she's really showing me that the guidance I was getting ahead of time is now, the time is now to make a change. That's kind of how spirit works in those subtle ways. It's not like I got a like major sign that came down with angels with wings in my house showing me with the marquee, get them new dog food. We have to listen for how it shows up. Just like, wow, she's like slowing down on the food she's eating, or she just doesn't feel the same way. We're listening for the things that aren't said. We're listening to those subtleties of information in front of us. And then you have your buckets, right? I was using an example of like, to improve a situation or make something better. We can also be listening to that about misinformation, disinformation, and information. Yeah. Is this true? Is this not true? Could this potentially be true? Am I willing to float that out there that it might be true? And allow ourselves, the big thing for the ego, and maybe this is something to round out with, and I'd love to hear what you think about the ego. But the ego also wants to try and control things. If we have a planet and a matrix that's trying to control human perception, that's just the nature of a lower vibrational realm, right? It's being managed and controlled. Then also our ego is actually responds. The ego has an external locus of control. It's trying to control, but something it can never control, which is why the ego is always stressed out, right? It's trying to manage a system that it was never designed to manage. So the ego wants us to be small. It wants us to kick out things and not consider things. It doesn't want us getting curious because it has enough trouble with what it can perceive and putting out fires all the time to try and keep you safe. It is motivated to keep you safe, but it's working without that connection to intuition and to that inner guidance system. And no wonder, talk about burnout or exhaustion. Like the ego has been burnt out on this planet for generations. It is so tired. It's like saying, can I have a little help here? But then when help is sent, it's like, no, that's conspiracy, right? So it's swatting away the help that often comes because it doesn't even trust when help is given, because it doesn't have these skills. So it's our higher intuitive senses and listening differently, deeper, and getting curious that allows other perspectives inside our very own ego to expand its sight, that it might say, I'm okay. I considered that bucket number 2 and I'm still here, right? It like checks itself and say, I didn't spontaneously self-destruct. I'm okay. And when you have more of those experiences, like I lived through that experience, I got curious about something and I looked at an article about it and I'm okay. And that helps us find a kind of neutrality versus being really charged up about the divisive propaganda and politics and everything else that goes on in our world to divide us. The more we can find our way into like, I'm willing, I'm okay, I can look at things, I can be curious, and I'm growing. if we could embrace that, boy, if that was on our news stations 24/7 and every day, what a different world that would be. But boy, the Matrix has absolutely zero investment in helping humanity to free itself. So that's why we have to do it ourselves. That's why you have to go to other podcasts like this, that the people can be working out. They could be listening to us by their earbuds, right? They can go for a walk. They can be on a road trip. A lot of people say that to me sometimes about my transmissions, that they'll download it from Spotify. Like, they're choosing what they're ingesting, right? They're choosing what's going to nourish them in their travels throughout their day. So they're putting in the good stuff, and they're finding ways to either release the darker stuff or the heavier stuff, or at the very least, not give life force to it, not spend a lot of time giving energy to it. So it just does start to dematerialize. Yeah.
Yeah, it starts to fall away. It's kind of like what you said earlier. Like, if you don't resonate with these TV shows or whatever's on TV anymore, and you start listening to something like this, that's of a higher vibration, has different messaging. Yeah, it's like you just naturally, it's wherever we put our attention is what is our reality. So,
Right.
so I totally love everything you just said about the ego. And I think in our world, yeah, we definitely rely on it it wants everything to be absolute and precise and real. And the world's much more messy than that. And it also shuts off the fear, and the ego basically make it so that the higher guidance and the intuition can't get through, and even the body can't get its messages through because they're more subtle.
Right.
So that's kind of the invitation there, is to say, is it so important that I'm right and I have it all figured out? If you can, like, just let go of that and then start listening to the subtler things. And it takes a while, there's a lot of noise at first, but over time you'll find a quietness and a peace, and you can start hearing the subtle messages. And as they come in, then it's like, oh yeah, wow, this is much different quality of information.
Much
And
different
yeah,
quality. Powerful. It is a peace that you said, right? It is like an ease that comes in. And when you get much better at it, it starts to feel like what we imagine grace is. When you have peace and ease long enough, and you find that neutrality, and you're listening to your heart. What does my heart say? What does my
yeah,
mind say about this? But what does my heart say about this? What does my bigger vision say? And I can say, what does my smaller vision see in this? And then what does my bigger vision? It's all these ways of letting ourselves come into this like wholeness of sight. That's what soul sight is. It's a whole vision. It's not a slice, but you
right,
build the slices together. We're weaving them back together,
yeah,
so they start to see holistically. And I love the way you describe the buckets. I think all these things help people walk in their journey with a little bit more confidence, because the fear is, what would I know if I got into something and I don't know what to do with it? Well, the beauty of not only the bucket system, but it's also, I don't have to know. I
yeah,
can be willing to let things be revealed to me. And you can ask God or spirit or your angels, whatever your language is, to pace that for you, to help you receive it in the doses that you can handle and that you need, right? Mine seem to be like coming crashing forward and pummeling me. But I think that's also the nature of my energy, and then I can cope with a lot of different things. And I'm very multitasking. I was a big multitasker back then. And so I could handle, 10, 20 balls in the air. No. They had to make it be something so big that
yeah. You
all those
couldn't. Yeah,
balls like fell down on top of my head and
source
said,
has a way of doing that.
right, are you gonna listen now?
Yeah.
And I was like, I think I'll listen. So
I have a great metaphor of, like, we're on the river of life on a boat, and if we go with the flow of the river, it's a pleasant journey, and we have free will, so we can take little day trips off to the island. But eventually, you have to come back onto the boat, and you're going to go to your destination. But if you start paddling the wrong direction, things will get harder and harder and harder in your life until you're back on the river flowing in the way you want to go. Or if you go off on the island, like, the volcano will eventually explode and you're back on the boat. So if that's getting into the vehicle, where the boat is the vehicle, the victor is, hey, I can explore the island. And then the victim is like, oh my God, like the world's collapsing. And
right, the sky is falling, little
yeah,
chicken
the sky's
little
falling.
type
Yeah.
scenario.
Um,
Well,
I wanted
yeah,
to bring one more thing
please.
that you said, which is amazing, is about, like, with the dogs, like allowing the time for the timing to be right. And that gets back to the surrender we talked about at the beginning, going, full circle is that if we can let our ego play like a very small part, like the conscious mind is a tool in our soul site, but it's a very small sliver, 5 or 10%, let's say. If we're trying to control our worlds, it's not going to go very well for us. And over time, as you foster this soul site, foster this intuition, this connection to source for ultimate discernment, and also trusting that whatever you need to do will show up exactly when you need it, and you'll know what to do. And when you hear the call, you do it, right? So a lot of times it's like, don't try to force the world, let it happen for you. And
Yes.
then it showed up to you at the moment that your dogs needed it. And so
Right.
you weren't like, oh, I have to research like endlessly and force this right now. When the time is right, boom, there it was, and you got exactly what you needed. So
That's right. And it clearly seems to be your experience the same. Like we can echo, we resonate, we both resonate with that because that's been our experience. And I've seen it in so many people and a lot of the teachers and the different messengers that I listen to. Like when you start to experience it yourself, you also see it mirrored that so many people that you then encounter, they're also having similar experiences of seeing things showing up in your life where you don't have to do so much the orchestrating. But it was a journey. Like when I talked about being a multitasker, that was something we all used to say with pride. And some people may still be like, oh, I'm such a great multitasker. And they joke about it at work or whatever. That was one of the things that the guides came through very directly. And they said, well, you're like a big multitasker. And I wasn't sure, like, is that a good thing? Or is that something I don't want to be? I couldn't tell. And then when they continued to give that message many times to me, I was realizing that was a vice for me. That was actually served as a distraction for me to be less present in trying to maximize all the windows of time in my day. And I had an ego attachment to that made me feel good multitasking. I didn't think that way before, but when that was pointed out to me and I was willing to consider it, I could see, maybe I don't have to be a multitasker. It hadn't really occurred to me. And then I had to learn how to unbe a multitasker, which started with making less lists, or making lists and not even trying to orchestrate how the time in my day was going to make. Like I didn't have like from 10 to 10:30, not that I ever did that, but I did have big lists that I wanted to accomplish this on Saturday, right? And you know what I found, which is what we're talking about as we close this out, is when I let spirit do it and I just set the intention that those few things were on my list, they all got done and I wasn't stressed. I just moved with the energy and it all happened, right? Maybe the first few times I did it, I can't even remember now. I'm sure there was maybe something I was like, well, we didn't get to that today. But I was just like, I flowed through the whole thing. I wasn't stressed. I wasn't trying to meet deadlines. I wasn't worried about not getting them done. I'm going to do this thing until it's done. And then I'll do the next thing, whatever that shows up to be. And my day flowed. And it's all that you've brought into this conversation today that made room for us to talk about these things, because people will do this again. We will have to podcast again, because I think it's the words we're using, the tools we're talking about, bringing the language back to people, but also the messages are in our presence. I hope people can feel we've learned how to unbe a multitasker. You've learned how to listen for where you're attracted to go when you were doing your searches. Even when you got overwhelmed sometimes by the amount of information you were finding, you needed a different pacing. And even that relaxed when you let things show up as they needed to show up. And you listen to your body saying, this is good, this is too much, this isn't enough. We start to listen to that, and we get to be messengers of that just in a conversation. That's part of our resonance of what like drew us together, is that we're living parallel lives in this way, knowing a lot of the same things and excited about the journey. And also knowing that even you and I, we're growing all the time. There are things that I don't know, and I'm willing to know them in the doses that I need them, just like I would expect you feel the same way.
Yeah. And in the timing when they show up. So.
And the timing when they show up, right? So, well, Matthew, thank you. Thank you for joining me. This is delightful to do this, to podcast together this first time. And I would definitely love to have you back. I
would love that. Yeah.
So much more that we can share. And I want to thank our listeners. I want to thank our listeners for spending this time, it's like, if we invest in ourselves in these ways where we allow ourselves, we give ourselves permission to tune into things that maybe previously we wouldn't have tuned into. We'd rather turn on a sports game, or, there's all these other ways that we can fill our time. But when we choose to listen to something like this, instead of like maybe a TV show or something, you're investing in yourself to learn something maybe you don't know, that's going to show up in a conversation like this, that might be something that unlocks a little portal inside you to go to the next level inside yourself, right? That frees you from some blocks or twists, or things where you've been avoiding things or distracting, or you pick up a tool, you're like, oh, that discernment thing is an amazing concept, and I want to actually practice it more in my life, so that I'm not just the victim of my life experience, right? I'm the victor, or even the vehicle. I love that you brought that in. So thank you to everybody who spent time with us today. Find us again. Matthew will be back again, and you can get more of podcasts with Matthew and I and others at wholesoulmastery.com. You can also, actually, to watch a lot of these videos, go to your favorite social media platforms. So YouTube and Rumble and Twitter and Telegram, places like that. And you can also find, of course, my transmissions that I post every 2 weeks on frequencywriter.com. And Matthew, do you have a place where people can find you and your work? Do you have a place?
Yeah, I have a website. If you want to hear some testimonials from people that have had some amazing results my system's called Subconscious Empowerment. So my website is habitualhealth.com/testimonials is where you can find those.
I'll put a link.
Habitualhealth.com. Yeah.
Habitualhealth.com. And it's Matthew Crofoot. And we'll see you again soon, hopefully. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you so much.
See you next time.